July 1944. A narrow street in Caen, Normandy, smoke hanging thick in the summer air. A British infantryman crouches behind rubble, watching a Panzer IV turn the corner 50 meters away. Its 7.5mm gun swivels, searching. The grinding of its treads echoes off shattered buildings. He reaches into his webbing, pulls out what looks like a stick, lights it like a cigarette. The match flares. He counts 3 seconds. 4, 5. He steps out, throws. The Panzer commander never sees it coming. The burning stick arcs through the air, tumbles end over end, lands against the tank's engine deck. Then the world turns white. The explosion tears through 3 inches of steel armor. Fuel ignites. Ammunition cooks off in a cascading roar that shatters every remaining window on the street. The crew has 7 seconds to escape. 2 make it out. 3 don't. The fire burns for 40 minutes. The device that killed them looked like a stick covered in canvas. Crude, primitive, something a child might make in a garden shed with glue and paper. It had no fins, no guidance system, no complex fusing mechanism, no precision engineering. It was, by conventional military standards, the cheapest anti-tank weapon ever issued to British forces. It was also the most feared hand-held explosive device carried by Allied infantry. This was the number 76 Special Incendiary Grenade, but every soldier who carried it knew it by another name, the SIP grenade. And across Normandy, Italy, and northwest Europe, German tank crews learned to fear the sight of British infantry carrying burning sticks. Because this wasn't just a grenade. It was liquid fire in a tin can, burning at temperatures that could melt steel, flowing like water into every crack and vent, impossible to extinguish, turning armoured vehicles into crematoriums in seconds. The weapon emerged from Britain's most desperate hour, when invasion seemed certain, and the British Army faced German Panzers with almost nothing capable of stopping them. Conventional anti-tank weapons required direct hits, training, and luck. Heavy equipment that infantry couldn't carry. Vulnerable supply lines that could be cut. What was needed was something different. Something any soldier could carry. Something cheap enough to mass, produced by the millions. Something that didn't need to penetrate armor, to kill what was inside. British engineers looked at the problem and asked a different question. Not how to punch through a tank's armor, but how to make the crew abandon it. How to turn the tank itself into the weapon. How to make steel and fuel and ammunition into a death trap. The answer came from chemistry, not ballistics. From understanding that metal, no matter how thick, has seams. Vents, hatches, access panels. Places where temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius could penetrate where bullets and shrapnel could not. They created a weapon that cost less than £1 to manufacture. A weapon that required no special training beyond lighting a match and counting to 5. A weapon simple enough that resistance fighters across occupied Europe could produce crude versions in basement workshops. The number 76 CP grenade represented a revolution in infantry anti-tank warfare and had achieved something remarkable. It gave foot soldiers with burning sticks a fighting chance against 30-ton steel machines. This is the story of how British desperation, chemical ingenuity, and mass production turned one of the simplest weapons of World War II into one of the most effective. How a device that looked like a cheap firework became a symbol of everything German tank crews learned to fear about fighting British infantry in close quarters. The problem facing British military planners in 1940 was a brutal paradox. They needed to stop German tanks, but they had almost nothing capable of doing so. After Dunkirk, the British Army had abandoned nearly all its heavy equipment on French beaches. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, the primary infantry anti-tank weapon, could barely scratch the armor of newer German Panzers. The weapon fired a .55 caliber round that had been designed in 1937 to penetrate tanks that no longer existed. Against a Panzer III or IV, it was nearly useless. Churchill understood the scope of the disaster. In June 1940, he wrote to the War Office, "I have lost the whole equipment of the army, to which all the first-line troops belonged." Britain faced invasion with an army that could be slaughtered by German armor, rolling unopposed through English villages. The strategic situation was desperate. Germany controlled the entire European coastline from Norway to Spain. Invasion barges gathered in French and Belgian ports. British intelligence estimated that Germany could land armoured formations within hours of launching an assault. and the British Army had precious little that could stop them. When infantry encountered German tanks in 1940, the tactical options were grim. The Boy's anti-tank rifle required a two-man crew, weighed 36 pounds, and generated recoil so violent it dislocated shoulders. Even perfect shots at close range often failed to penetrate. Sticky bombs, officially designated number 74 grenades, required soldiers to approach within meters of a moving tank, attach the device by hand, and retreat before detonation. Many died trying. Anti-tank mines were effective but static, useless in mobile warfare. Artillery could destroy tanks but required precise coordination, clear lines of sight, and guns that were desperately needed elsewhere. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun could penetrate most German armor, but each gun weighed nearly a ton and required a crew of 6. In North Africa in 1941, British infantry learned the cost of inadequate anti-tank weapons. During Operation Crusader, German Panzers repeatedly overran British positions because infantry had no way to defend themselves. One corporal wrote home, "We watched them come. We fired everything we had. Nothing stopped them. They rolled right through us." The fundamental requirement was clear. British infantry needed a hand-held weapon that could disable or destroy a tank without requiring direct armor penetration, that weighed less than 5 pounds, that could be produced quickly and cheaply enough to equip every infantry section in the British Army, that required minimal training to use effectively, and that was reliable enough to function in desert heat, European cold, and tropical humidity. Every conventional approach failed this requirement. Armor-piercing rounds required high velocities and direct hits. High explosive grenades lacked the blast force to damage tanks. Shaped charges were experimental and complex to manufacture. Magnetic mines required dangerous proximity and worked poorly on non-magnetic armor. What the British needed wasn't better penetration. It was a way to exploit the inherent vulnerabilities of armored vehicles. Because tanks, despite their intimidating armor, had critical weaknesses that conventional weapons couldn't exploit. Every tank required engine cooling. Air intake vents drew oxygen into the engine compartment. Those vents couldn't be fully armored without causing the engine to overheat and fail. Every tank had vision ports where crews observed the battlefield. Those ports had thin armor or glass that could crack under extreme heat. Every tank had ammunition stored inside the crew compartment. If that ammunition reached ignition temperature, the tank would be destroyed from within. The Germans understood tank vulnerability better than most. Their own doctrine emphasized combined arms precisely because tanks operating without infantry support could be disabled or destroyed by determined defenders at close range. But German anti-tank doctrine still relied on conventional weapons, anti-tank guns, mines, and Panzerfaust rockets that wouldn't be developed until 1943. British planners recognized something the Germans had missed. You didn't need to punch through armor if you could set the tank on fire from the outside. If you could generate temperatures high enough to ignite fuel, detonate ammunition, or force the crew to abandon their vehicle, the armor became irrelevant. The tank itself became the kill mechanism. In 1940, with invasion imminent and conventional weapons inadequate, British engineers began exploring an approach that seemed almost primitive. Not explosives designed to penetrate steel, but incendiaries designed to burn so hot and so persistently that armored vehicles became uninhabitable. The British needed something different. They needed fire that couldn't be extinguished, heat that could melt metal, and a delivery system simple enough that any soldier could use it. The solution would come from understanding chemistry as much as warfare. The solution came from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, known universally as MD1. At the Firs near Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, MD1 operated from a requisitioned country house that had been transformed into Britain's most unconventional weapons laboratory. Established in 1939 under Major Millis Jefferies, the Firs became the centre of British irregular warfare technology. The facility was deliberately isolated, surrounded by testing grounds where experimental devices could be evaluated away from populated areas. Under Jefferies, MD1 became responsible for developing weapons that conventional military thinking had overlooked. During the war, it produced the Limpet mine, the P8 anti-tank weapon, and dozens of specialized devices for commando and resistance operations. but among its most tactically valuable products was the No. 76 IP grenade. The lead designer was Lieutenant Colonel Stuart McCrae, Jeffress's deputy and a former magazine editor with no formal military training. McCrae approached weapons development not as an ordnance engineer, but as a problem solver willing to challenge every assumption about how military equipment should function. The fundamental challenge of creating an effective incendiary anti-tank weapon broke down into three components. First, the incendiary compound needed to burn hot enough to ignite fuel and penetrate ventilation systems. Second, it needed to adhere to vertical and angled surfaces rather than simply rolling off armored plating. Third, it needed to be stable enough for mass production and field handling, yet reliable enough to ignite consistently under combat conditions. To achieve effectiveness against armored vehicles, all three had to be solved simultaneously. The temperature problem. Standard incendiary compounds like thermite burned extremely hot, but required magnesium igniters and didn't adhere to surfaces. Petrol burned readily, but evaporated too quickly and lacked sufficient heat intensity to threaten armored vehicles. The solution was white phosphorus suspended in a benzene-rubber solution. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously on contact with air, burning at temperatures exceeding 815 degrees Celsius. When the grenade's thin metal casing ruptured on impact, atmospheric oxygen triggered immediate ignition. The phosphorus didn't just burn, it vaporized, creating clouds of phosphorus pentoxide that were themselves incendiary and toxic. The adhesion problem. Liquid incendiaries ran off angled armor surfaces before they could generate sufficient heat. The weapon needed to stick where it landed, maintaining contact long enough to exploit vulnerabilities. The solution was revolutionary. Engineers mixed the white phosphorus with a synthetic rubber compound that created a gel-like consistency. When ignited, this mixture behaved like napalm before napalm was officially developed. It clung to metal surfaces, flowing into vents and seams while continuing to burn. Tank crews described it as liquid fire that couldn't be scraped off or extinguished. The stability problem. White phosphorus is extraordinarily dangerous. It ignites spontaneously when exposed to air and burns through human flesh in seconds. Creating a weapon that soldiers could safely carry required careful engineering. The solution involved sealing the phosphorus-rubber mixture inside a thin metal canister under an inert atmosphere. The grenade consisted of a glass bottle containing the incendiary compound, surrounded by a metal outer casing, with a simple impact fuse at the nose. When thrown, the grenade struck the target, the glass bottle shattered, the phosphorus contacted air, and ignition occurred within milliseconds. The effect was extraordinary. Standard grenades might scorch paint or dent thin armor. The SIP grenade created temperatures sufficient to warp steel plating, melt rubber seals, and ignite anything flammable within a 3-meter radius. Production began in late 1940. Manufacturing was simpler than conventional grenades because the weapon required no complex fusing mechanism or explosive charges. Factories produced the metal casings. Glass bottles were filled with the phosphorus-rubber mixture under controlled conditions, and final assembly took place at secure facilities. The weapon itself measured approximately 5 inches in length and 2 inches in diameter. Weight was 14 ounces when filled. Capacity was roughly 4 ounces of incendiary compound. Effective range was 20 to 30 meters when thrown. Optimal use was against engine decks, track assemblies, and ventilation grills where heat could penetrate into vulnerable compartments. The grenade's appearance was deliberately utilitarian, a cylindrical metal body wrapped in fabric tape for grip, with a simple impact nose. Soldiers called them matches because of the fabric tape wrapping and the need to light a phosphorus igniter strip before throwing. They looked cheap, crude, like something assembled in a workshop rather than a military factory. That ordinariness masked lethality that German tank crews would learn to respect. Production began in October 1940, accelerating rapidly as invasion fears peaked, and then sustaining through 1944 as Allied forces prepared for continental operations. The exact numbers remain partially classified, but War Office records indicate that over 6 million SIP grenades were manufactured between 1940 and 1945. The scale reflected both the weapon's low production cost and the military's recognition that infantry needed mass quantities of portable anti-tank weapons. Each grenade cost approximately 11 pence to produce, making it one of the most economical weapons in the British arsenal. Distribution relied on standard supply channels rather than special operations aircraft. The grenades shipped to infantry units across every theatre where British forces operated. North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, and Burma all received substantial quantities. By late 1944, standard infantry sections carried side grenades alongside conventional munitions. The first significant operational use came in North Africa during 1941 and 1942. British infantry facing Rommel's Afrika Korps used SIP grenades during close quarters defensive fighting when German armour penetrated British lines. In Libya, the 7th Armour Division's infantry brigades employed SIP grenades extensively during the fighting around Tobruk. German tanks advancing through defensive positions found themselves targeted not with anti-tank guns that could be located and destroyed, but with small groups of infantry emerging from cover to throw incendiary grenades at close range. One particularly well-documented action occurred in November 1941 during Operation Crusader. A section of the Rifle Brigade defending a position near Sidi Rezai engaged 3 Panzer III tanks that had broken through the main defensive line. The infantry had no anti-tank guns. They waited until the Panzers were within 30 meters, then threw SIP grenades targeting the engine decks. 2 of the 3 tanks caught fire within seconds. Crews abandoned both vehicles as flames spread through engine compartments and threatened ammunition storage. The 3rd Panzer withdrew. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes, and British casualties were 0. In Italy, partisan groups and Allied infantry used SIP grenades during urban fighting where conventional anti-tank weapons were too cumbersome. The narrow streets of Italian towns created ideal conditions for close-range attacks. German armour moving through urban areas faced infantry positioned in buildings above street level, dropping incendiary grenades onto vulnerable top armour. The psychological effect was substantial. Tank commanders learned to avoid streets where infantry might be concealed in upper floors. In Northwest Europe after D-Day, SIP grenades became standard equipment for infantry advancing through bocage country and urban areas. The dense hedgerows of Normandy forced armour into predictable routes where infantry could establish ambush positions. British infantry sections defending villages against counterattacks used SIP grenades as area denial weapons, targeting German armour attempting to exploit breakthroughs. If you're finding this deep dive into unconventional British anti-tank weapons interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. The psychological impact on German tank crews was considerable. Wehrmacht training emphasized combined arms operations where infantry protected tanks from close-range threats. But when tanks operated without adequate infantry support, particularly during breakthrough attempts or pursuit operations, they became vulnerable to defenders armed with incendiary weapons. German crews began recognizing that British infantry positions were far more dangerous than intelligence had suggested. Tank commanders became reluctant to advance through areas where infantry might be concealed, slowing operational tempo and reducing the effectiveness of armored exploitation. German anti-incendiary measures included modified ventilation systems and external armor screens, but these modifications added weight and complexity. By 1944, German tanks incorporated improved engine deck protection, a direct response to Allied incendiary weapons. Comparisons to enemy weapons. German incendiary anti-tank weapons during this period were primarily glass bottles filled with petrol and cloth wicks, essentially Molotov cocktails. These devices could achieve temperatures around 600 degrees Celsius, sufficient to damage thin armor or ignite fuel externally. However, they required direct contact with fuel tanks or engine components, and often failed to generate sustained burning. They were also dangerous to carry and unreliable in wet conditions. American forces used the M14 thermite grenade, which burned at approximately 200 degrees Celsius using a thermite reaction. This weapon achieved higher peak temperatures than the British SIP grenade, but required a magnesium igniter and didn't adhere to surfaces, limiting effectiveness against vertical armor. The British No. 76 SIP grenade achieved sustained burning at over 800 degrees Celsius with a self-adhering compound that required only impact ignition. In the brutal calculus of infantry anti-tank warfare, It occupied a category defined by reliability, ease of use, and tactical effectiveness that neither German improvised weapons nor American thermite grenades could match. The broader incendiary and close-range anti-tank campaign achieved devastating results through combined methods. Between 1940 and 1945, British infantry using hand-held anti-tank weapons including assault grenades, sticky bombs, and Piat launchers destroyed or disabled thousands of German armoured vehicles in circumstances where conventional anti-tank guns were unavailable or impractical. During the Normandy campaign alone, infantry launched incendiary attacks accounted for an estimated 12% of German tank losses in close quarters fighting. Around Caen and in the Bocage, maintaining armoured mobility required what one German Panzer commander called constant infantry escort at distances where protection becomes impossible, tying down infantry resources desperately needed elsewhere and reducing the operational flexibility that made German armoured doctrine effective. Whether the SIP grenade contributed the majority of these losses matters less than whether it contributed to the climate of tactical caution and psychological vulnerability that characterized German armoured operations after 1942. Tank crews who knew that British infantry carried weapons capable of turning their vehicles into furnaces fought differently than crews who believed armour made them invulnerable. The concept's influence extended beyond 1945. United States military historical reviews note that the SEP grenade's phosphorus-rubber gel formulation directly influenced napalm development programs during the late 1940s. The weapon pioneered what became standard doctrine for infantry anti-armor operations: exploit vulnerabilities rather than attempt penetration, use chemistry rather than kinetics, prioritize crew suppression over vehicle destruction. The weapon pioneered what became fundamental principles for asymmetric warfare: modern thermite grenades used by special operations forces, incendiary compounds deployed against vehicle engine compartments in counterinsurgency operations, and chemical-based area denial weapons trace their conceptual lineage to MD1's innovations at the FIRS. The recognition that sophisticated armor could be defeated by simple chemistry informed decades of military development. Examples exist today in museums, including the Imperial War Museum in London and the Royal Armouries, though live specimens were destroyed after the war due to the extreme hazards white phosphorus presents during storage. July 1944. Smoke hanging thick in Normandy streets. The acrid smell of burning metal and rubber. Tank crews learning that armour alone provides no sanctuary. British engineers created a weapon so effective that its simplicity became its greatest tactical advantage, so cheap that 6 million could be manufactured and distributed without straining wartime budgets, so reliable that soldiers with minimal training could deploy it successfully under combat stress. A weapon Germany feared despite having thicker armour, heavier guns, and superior tank design. A weapon that cost 11 pence to produce but could destroy a 30-ton Panzer IV in seconds. A weapon that looked like a stick wrapped in tape but burned hot enough to melt steel and ignite ammunition. 6 million grenades manufactured, distributed to infantry units across North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, and Burma. Unknown thousands of German tanks disabled, destroyed, or abandoned by crews who chose survival over burning alive inside their machines. The number 76 SIP grenade represents British weapons development at its most pragmatic, a weapon measured not in armour penetration or explosive force, but in psychological impact, tactical flexibility, and the fundamental understanding that killing a tank's crew matters more than destroying the vehicle itself. British engineers solved a problem that conventional military thinking had approached incorrectly. They recognized that armor created vulnerabilities as well as protection, that chemistry could achieve what ballistics could not, that mass production of simple weapons could be more effective than limited production of complex ones. They turned Germany's armored advantage into a liability, and they did it with white phosphorus, rubber, glass bottles, and metal casings that together cost less than a pint of beer. That was British ingenuity. That was MD1. And that was how soldiers carrying burning sticks gave infantry a fighting chance against the panzers that had conquered Europe.